The sky has turned dark and the clouds have gathered. As you stand on the hill, the only light that you can see is the light that comes from the village. The forest behind you is quiet, with only some birds giving it some life. The wind is howling and you feel a chill in the air. The wind becomes so strong that the clouds move away in a rapid speed. One by one, the stars reappear, and suddenly, slowly, the biggest light of them all reveals itself. The moon. But tonight, the moon has even more light. It is bigger. It's full. The sounds of birds fades away and it turns completely silent. Now it's not the wind that's howling. It's wolves. But not just regular wolves. Werewolves. Ready to feast on the innocent. So you take a run for it. Hi everyone and welcome back to a new video, which is my Halloween special of this year. And I recently turned 30, so for me it's also a very spooky time. This video was requested a year ago by Catspaw3092 and my apologies that it took so long to make it. But I thought it was a nice one since I already did vampires to do another Halloween special about another mysterious, ancient, mythological being. Which, as you already know, is about werewolves. And when I think about werewolves, I can't really recall when I first heard about them. I know that I played The Sims 2 and they were included in that game. I also know, of course, the Twilight Saga, which had werewolves. Even earlier than that, I think I've seen them in Harry Potter and in the Underworld series. Remus Lupin was one of my favorite characters. And I play the Witcher games, which also include werewolves. It doesn't matter anyway. The only thing that matters is that I always loved it when they were included in stories about supernatural beings. And especially since they are often a tragic figure which you feel a lot of sympathy for. But where did all the modern media got its inspiration to write these stories? Who started it and where did it originate? In this video we will look at the history and all the stories about werewolves. Make sure that you have a silver bullet because we will encounter a lot of them. Let's start with the word werewolf. It comes from the Old English word werewolf, which translates to man-wolf. Funny enough, it's a cognate of cognitive, I don't know, of the Dutch word we still use, or the Old Dutch word, which is werewolf. Like the name suggests, it means that the individual that is either inflicted or cursed with this condition is also forced to transform into a werewolf on the night of a full moon. There's also a more difficult name that describes the same creature, which is lycanthrope, and it comes from the Old Greek word lycanthropos, which translates to wolf human. The way that we think about werewolves is deeply influenced by Hollywood. Most of the tropes that we associate with werewolves are mostly from modern cinematic movies, from horror, from books, like the silver bullet, the transformation bite and the full moon. But the concept of the werewolf as a creature has been around for centuries. And the first story is even older than ancient Greece itself. One of the first werewolf stories ever is the story of Gilgamesh. It's one of the oldest texts from the 2nd millennium BC. It was written down for the ancient king of Uruk, which would later be known as Mesopotamia. A place that is already known for its history with vampires. It was written down for the enjoyment of the king's court and to celebrate all the glory of the former kings. The name of the story comes from the main character Gilgamesh. He was a god king and the son of Lucabanda, who was the 5th king of the 1st dynasty. This king was probably a real-life king, but for this story he's gonna be fictional. Gilgamesh's path crossed the path of the goddess of fertility, love, war and sex, and her name was Ishtar. She fell in love with Gilgamesh and wanted to earn his affection. Gilgamesh, on the other hand, was not interested. He knew how she treated her suitors, and he didn't want to follow in their footsteps. One young shepherd in particular fell in love with Ishtar. He left bountiful offerings at her shrine on a mountainside. At first, Ishtar enjoyed it. She was arrogant and loved flattery. He kept showing his devotion by bringing more offerings, but eventually Ishtar grew bored of them. So she decided to transform him into a wolf, just for her own amusement. When the shepherd returned to his farm, his dogs did not recognize him anymore. After all, he was a wolf now. They tore him to bits and pieces, and the poor man died in his new body. Therefore, Gilgamesh was not interested in her advances, and he rejected her, a wise choice from a wise prince. I did not know about this story, so it was very interesting to learn about it. Especially since it's one of the oldest, or even the oldest story about werewolves. And since we are speaking about old stories, let's return to ancient Greece. There are a few references about men changing into wolf in Greek literature and mythology and folklore. One story was even written down by the Greek historian Herodotus. He wrote that according to the Scythians and the Greeks, a tribe named the Nyori had the ability to transform into werewolves. This tribe lived in the northeast of Scythia. They could transform into a wolf for several days each year, and they could later transform back into their human form. The locals swore that this was the truth, but Herodotus was skeptical. Another Greek, Pausanias, who was known for his travels, wrote about the story of King Lycaon of Arcadia. He had killed and cooked his own son, Nyctimus, and served him to Zeus. Don't ask me why. But Zeus recognized that the flesh was human flesh, and he was not pleased, to say the least. He was disgusted and wanted to punish Lycaon for his horrendous deed. Zeus decided to transform Lycaon into a wolf, and he resurrected Nyctimus. And it's possible that you know a different variation of this story, because Greek mythology can be told in different ways. So the werewolf can be found in Greek mythological stories, but what about reality? Well, of course, I already mentioned the story that Herodotus wrote about the Scythians, but these people came from a land which is now known as a part of Russia. So that's not the warm Greece that you would imagine, but rather a place that was very cold and had a harsh environment. This tribe probably used wolf skin to keep themselves warm. It's possible that Herodotus saw them walking around with wolf skin and that he wrote down that this was their way of transforming into a werewolf. Other literary evidence suggests that cult members mixed human flesh in their ritual sacrifices to Zeus. There's even a story about an Olympic boxer named Demarcus. For the festival of Lycaon, it was really normal to sacrifice a human body to Zeus. And I know it's contradictory to the other story, but just ignore it for now. So for this sacrifice, they killed a young boy. But instead of offering it to Zeus, Demarcus decided to eat the boy himself. Zeus, who is always looking for revenge, did not like this fact, and he was not a fan of cannibalism. So he decided to curse Demarcus for this heinous act. Demarcus was cursed to become a wolf, and he could only lift the curse if he would abstain from human flesh for 9 or in some stories 10 years. If he would taste the flesh of men, he would remain a beast forever. This story was even written down by Pliny the Elder and by Pausanias, who were both very famous and respectable ancient Greek writers. And according to most stories, Demarcus was able to contain himself and he was cured from his curse. The Romans also had their own wolf stories, but instead of calling them man-wolf or werewolves, they would call them skin changers, which was in old Roman versipels. Of course, you have the story of Romulus and Remus, but that was just a regular wolf and not a skin changer. A story about a werewolf can be found in the Satyricon Liber, which translates to the Book of Satire-like Adventures. It is believed to be written by Gaius Petronius in the first late century AD. The stories are mostly about two friends called Encolopes and Gita, who were also lovers, and they were both boys. But one of the stories is about a man named Nikiros, who was a soldier and traveled to a distant city with one of his acquaintances. While they were traveling, they stopped at a graveyard to relieve themselves. Suddenly, Nikiros' companion starts laughing wickedly, rips off his clothes and transforms into a wolf. He runs off to a nearby town, howling in the wind. Nikiros couldn't believe his eyes. What did just happen? He walked towards the clothes of his companion, only to discover that they have been turned into stone. Nikiros is reluctant to return to the town, but he had no choice. He is scared to death, even so scared that he attacks his own shadow. When he returns to the town, he encounters a woman who tells him that the wolf had killed several farm animals, but that they were able to kill him with a spear through his throat. The wolfman was no more, and Nikiros would never ever learn or understand what just happened. But what is the moral of this story? Well, urinating in a graveyard is a real big insult to the dead, but I guess you already could imagine that yourself. Therefore, you would be punished in a supernatural manner. Although I don't understand why Nikiros got away with it. Oh well. Stories about werewolves were most prominently in European folklore, especially during the medieval times. No other animal has matched the influence of the wolf in European tales of human to animal transformations. But why were they often the main character in European stories? Probably because the wolf was one of the largest natural predators Europeans had. A wolf was dangerous, unpredictable, and hard to defeat. A good description for a fearsome predator in your story. At first, werewolves were not necessarily evil. In earlier Nordic stories, the werewolf was seen as something positive. In the Nordic folklore, the wolf or werewolf would help the heroes in their quest, and they would make sure that they would return victorious. Only later they were transformed in the evil beasts that we know in our modern stories. And this is probably because of Christianity. They often adopted pagan beliefs and turned them evil. For example, the Greek god Pan was used as a design for the devil. And of course the devil had evil powers. So if someone could transform into something, it was always the devil's doing. Because the devil was evil and had no good intentions. So if the devil chose you to become one of his cursed minions, even if it was not your choice, you had to be punished. Although I need to point out that this is not strictly in line with the Christian theology. This theology states that God is the only being who is strong enough to grant power. He would never transform anything in some evil being. Some Christians also claimed that no werewolves existed, but that the illusions were conjured by the devil or one of his demons. From Europe, the stories were spread to other parts of the world due to colonialism. The European stories intertwined with the stories from indigenous tribes like the Navajo people and their witches in wolf clothing called Maikop, and the Loup-garou in Canada. And there was one creature that I already thought of when I was reading about all these creatures, which is also a creature from Native American folklore. And this creature is called the Wendigo. And if you have played Until Dawn, you know what I'm talking about. Although the Wendigo does not look like a werewolf, it has some of the same characteristics. It also has human-like features, and it's also cursed because it ate human flesh. This creature also comes out during the night, and it was feared all throughout the land. And perhaps someday I will make an entire video about the Wendigo, or maybe even about American mythical creatures from folklore. So for now we return to Europe, because that's where everything kind of was happening surrounding werewolves. The werewolf and witch were parallel to each other in many stories. Not only were there witch trials, but also supposed werewolf trials. It emerged from Switzerland in the early 15th century and found its way throughout Europe, reaching its peak in the 17th century. People thought that witches used werewolves to ride on them or to charm them, so that they could use them to defeat their enemies. The werewolf trials were spread throughout Europe, but especially in countries and areas which were located in forests and had a lot of wild wolves, like Germany, France and the Netherlands. In England and the Mediterranean area you can't even find evidence of werewolf trials. The biggest reason for England is because they hunted wolves, so they were practically eradicated, and in the Mediterranean area there were no wolves to be found. The number of werewolf trials pales in comparison to the witch trials. For every werewolf trial, there were 10,000 times more witches trials. Only 300 cases have been counted in Germany, and most of the time only men were accused of being a werewolf. It was mostly a serial killer that was accused of being a werewolf. Why else would a human be so brutal or beastly? Examples of this were the Scandinavian berserkers, who were wild warriors who loved nothing more than to plunder and massacre their way around Europe. Or a French tailor that was burnt alive in 1589 for being a werewolf, because they found children's bones in his house. And there was Jean Grenier, who was a teenage cannibal who was caught after he failed to attack a young girl. And since I was researching all these stories, I thought it was fun to see if the Netherlands, where I come from, also had a werewolf story. And I found one. And this story is about Volkert Dirksz. And he was accused of enchanting horses. His sons were interrogated, and one of his sons, the 13-year-old Albert, admitted that he, his father and his brother Hessel left the house during the night to go to a field near the city of Bunschoten. He claimed that there, under a full moon, they were all transformed into werewolves. He and his brother collected all the cattle so that his father could kill them with his sharp teeth. Hessel told the interrogators that he was visited by the devil and a woman, and that they changed themselves into werewolves and killed all the cattle in the Eemland. Although this story was very confusing, some witnesses claimed that it was true. Only their father Volkert was found guilty, and he was strangled by the executioner and eventually burned at the stake. One of the more famous examples of a real-life werewolf was the story of Peter Stump. He was a 50-year-old German farmer who claimed to have made a pact with the devil. Why? Not for wealth or glory, he just wanted the ability to turn into a werewolf. On October the 31st, 1598, a large crowd gathered in the German city of Bedburg near Cologne because Peter Stump was to be executed. Not only did he claim to have made a pact with the devil, with his evil deeds he became the devil himself. He killed 16 people, of whom 13 were children. One of his victims was his son, whose brain he allegedly devoured. He also told people that he had a sexual relationship with his daughter and also with a succubus, which is a demon disguised as a beautiful woman. This made it not hard to believe for the public that this man was truly a werewolf. No human could act this way. Only the devil could take you there. He would not get away with this the easy way. His execution would be known as one of the most brutal executions and the harshest trials during Germany's werewolf panics. He was strapped to a wheel and skinned alive. They also broke all of his bones and decapitated him. After this, his body was burned at the stake. To make sure that nobody would follow his path, they placed his head on a stake at the entrance of the city for everyone to see. Many of the few people who were burned at the stake for being a werewolf were believed to have suffered from a physical illness which is called lycanthropy, and these people would wholeheartedly believe that they were werewolves and they would tell everybody. Sometimes they would even kill human beings in a brutal manner to support their claim. And in some cases they even ate them. But why did people back then believe that werewolves were real? It's the same reason why people back then believed in other supernatural beings like vampires and dragons. They couldn't explain the world around them like we can do now. If they would see a brutal murder, they couldn't comprehend why someone would act that way. And when someone acted strange, they couldn't diagnose them with a disease or some mental illness. They didn't even know that such a thing existed. And if someone was sick, it surely was a disease that the devil had caused. If we want to know things, we just ask Google. But they had to find their own explanations. The horror stories from hundreds of years ago can teach us a lot about the human psyche and the cultural fears of that time period. Famine, plague, war, and religious struggles gave rise to superstitious beliefs. It's very interesting and intriguing. But the closer we come to the modern day, the less we are in need of these stories to explain the world around us. Stories of real werewolves died when people became more intelligent. This happened around the 17th century as medicine and psychology advanced. They were able to find other explanations, so werewolves became fictional beings. And in the 18th century, the famous werewolves of literature were introduced. The cursed human who was forced to become a werewolf during the full moon. A human in constant conflict with itself, and a tragic figure who almost never had a happy ending. And after the literature, they found their way to the silver screen. And they haven't been absent from the world ever since. Now we're gonna talk about the appearance of a werewolf. What did a werewolf look like? The first thing you would think about is a man-like wolf, very hairy and scary, dark of color and with huge fangs. And in most cases they look exactly like that. Some examples only use 2 legs to walk on to differentiate the werewolf from the regular wolf. But in some cases they don't look any different from a wolf, except in size. Sometimes they even have some of their human features, like their eyes and their hair color, as fur. And most of the time they also don't have a tail, to show once again that they are no wolf, but something supernatural. Were you hurt as a werewolf? Then your wounds would show if you turned back into your human form, so the people who hunted the werewolf would know it was you. Did you suddenly gain muscles and become super strong? Or would you suddenly disappear during a full moon night? People would find that very suspicious and they would make their own conclusions. In countries where wolves weren't present, there were similar beings, but they were based on other animals, like hyenas, bears or bisons or other animals. There are many ways to become a werewolf. The most well-known way is when a werewolf scratches or bites you. Of course, without you dying from the injury. But this is a very modern concept, which is mostly used in horror stories. You hardly find stories like this in older texts. A more common way was by removing your clothing and replacing it with a belt made of wolfskin, which had to be a very large skin. Sometimes it was as easy as drinking rainwater from the footprints of a werewolf or drinking water from enchanted streams. In France, Germany and Italy, they believed that if you slept on a summer day with your face in the full moon's light on a Wednesday or Friday, you would transform into a werewolf. In Brazil, they believed that if you had 7 daughters and the 8th baby would be a son, that this son would eventually turn into a werewolf in adulthood. It could also be a curse, a punishment from the gods or God, if you would crave human flesh or if you would invoke the wrath of a divine being. Although it sounds cool to turn into another creature, the human in question is mostly not very thrilled to have been cursed with this supernatural form. So how could you cure yourself from this curse? Well, there were various methods to remove the werewolf form. And yes, even in reality. Because even though there was no evidence, there were still people who claimed that they were inflicted with this condition. The ancient Greeks and Romans believed if you would exhaust the inflicted person by subjecting them to long periods of physical activity, that this would cure them. But why did they think that this would work? Well, many people who claimed to be a werewolf, or in the Greek-Roman case a lycanthrope, claimed to feel weak and debilitated after a night of committing depredations. So they thought that if they could weaken the mind, it would purge them from their malady. Medieval Europe used medicine like wolfsbane to medically heal the condition. Sometimes they even tried to operate or tried exorcism, most of the time with fatal consequences. Of course, some Christians took advantage of this by proclaiming that if you would give them money or become a Christian, you could be cured from your werewolf form, or you could be protected from becoming a werewolf. In the German Schleswig-Holstein, they had a very simple cure. You just had to address the werewolf 3 times by his Christian name. And in Danish beliefs, you just had to scold the werewolf. But sometimes there was no cure. You just had to lock yourself up and wait until the full moon had passed. Of course, you couldn't free yourself, so you needed someone who would come in the morning to free you when you've become a human again. Back to the future, or better said, to the recent times. What kind of influence do werewolves have these days? Like I mentioned before, belief in werewolves has died out. Perhaps there are some civilizations who are less advanced who still believe in werewolves, but even in religion, they are just a part of the stories from past times. There are still reports of beasts that look like humans, but they are mostly seen during the night. And most of the time they are seen by people who come back from a party. So perhaps you can already guess why they would see things like that. You will always have people who will tell stories that are hard to believe and stories that you can't find the evidence of, but we all love stories like that. We modern people like to keep the werewolf in our fictional world. Especially teenage girls like to fantasize about their own Jacob Black, who comes to get them to take them on a ride on his back when he has turned into a wolf. But the stories from the past will always be used as a lesson or inspiration to create new interpretations of this intriguing creature. We brought werewolves into the world to explain our beastly instincts and behaviors. They symbolize themes of transformation and duality. Therefore, they will probably be immortal in our stories from now and from the future. After all, we are animals, even though we don't like to admit it. So we've reached the end of this video, and perhaps you have learned more about your own animal instinct, or at least you have learned more about the werewolves. I really loved making the script for this video. It was one of the scripts that took me the longest time because I really wanted to use as much information as I could find. It even became longer than I expected. But as long as you guys appreciate it, I don't mind. So thank you so much for watching my Halloween special of this year. I really hope you enjoyed it. I wonder if this stuff is gonna be still there when I have my party, because when I record this video, I'm still 29. I'm turning 30 in 2 days and my party is not until 2 weeks later or 3, I don't know. So I hope that I still have this stuff to use for my next year, for the next Halloween specials that I'm gonna make for you. For now, thank you so much for watching my video. I will have another video for you this year, I promise. Maybe even 2, but I will promise 1. Because I know if I promise you something, I have to do it. And I don't want to break a promise. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can give me a like. And if you enjoyed it even more, you can subscribe to my channel. If you have other suggestions for videos, you can put them in the comment section. And I use them because this was also suggested. So feel free to suggest. And I hope to see you the next time. Have a very nice Halloween. Go trick-or-treating. Be nice to everyone. And I see you the next time. Bye.